Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew remained perfectly still, his body partially concealed by the shadow of a nearby building, the kind of shadow that swallowed a man whole yet allowed his eyes to pierce forward with an unrelenting sharpness. He had positioned himself with meticulous precision, close enough to study every detail of the moment but far enough to remain unseen, a silent predator observing his prey. His gaze never wavered from the two women standing in the open. Stella and Portia, their arms encircling each other in an embrace that was both tender and defiant. It was not merely a gesture of affection, it radiated strength, unity, and a shared understanding built on years of loyalty and mutual trust. To anyone else, it would have been a touching moment, a quiet display of family love in a world that too often fractured such bonds. But to Drew, the sight was a direct affront, a slap in the face wrapped in silk. His chest tightened, heat rising in slow, smoldering waves that pulsed through his veins until it threatened to set his entire body alight. The embrace between Stella and Portia was not benign in his eyes, it was a declaration. A reminder that the fortress of loyalty surrounding Curtis was still intact, and that fortress had no place for him. The quiet solidarity they shared was the very thing he despised most. It represented a wall he could not yet breach, a wall he was determined to reduce to rubble, brick by brick. And if it took dragging the most respected members of their family into the dirt to make that happen, so be it. Drew's thoughts drifted back to the bitter ledger he carried in his mind, a mental tally of every loss, every humiliation, every betrayal he believed had been orchestrated or enabled by Curtis and those who stood with him. He had once stood on the precipice of a flawless public image, poised to step into the highest tiers of influence with a reputation untainted. That image had been shattered. The trust of allies and backers had dissolved into suspicion and disdain. And most bitter of all, he had lost control over Willow, the one person he was determined to bind to him in a way that would be inescapable. It wasn't merely about love. It was about dominance, about ensuring that her life, her choices, and even her happiness would be tethered to his will. In Drew's mind, all of it, the collapse of his ambitions, the erosion of his support, the loss of Willow, was linked in a chain whose first link was Curtis, and whose steel had been forged by the family around him. Now, Stella was next on his list. Age meant nothing. Respectability meant nothing. She might be the moral pillar of the Ashford family, a woman whose years of work at the hospital had earned her a reputation for compassion and integrity, but Drew knew too well that every facade, no matter how polished, concealed its flaws. He believed in weaknesses the way other men believed in fate, inevitable, inescapable, and exploitable. Stella's came in the form of an old decision, one that had slipped under the radar, bending the insurance system to help Martin. To most, it was an act of mercy, a bending of rules for the sake of justice. But to Drew, it was a crack in her armor, and cracks were meant to be split wide open. In his mind, the blueprint was already laid out in cold, precise detail. He would start by quietly confronting Stella with what he knew, wrapping the memory of her past actions in the cold steel of a threat. The goal wasn't to ruin her immediately, that would be wasteful. The goal was to own her, to make her act on his behalf while believing she had no choice. From there, he would steer her toward Portia, planting the seeds of fear and urgency that would make her pliable. Stella would become the instrument of persuasion, convincing Portia to commit the ultimate breach of medical ethics, falsifying Michael's records to make it appear that he had a history of opioid abuse. Once the forged documents were in play, Drew could see the dominoes falling with perfect clarity. Michael's credibility would implode, his reputation as a fit father shredded beyond repair. The custody of Wiley and Amelia would be stripped from his hands and handed to Willow. And then Drew, ever the calculated opportunist, would arrive as the orchestrator of her victory. In the theater of her life, he would cast himself as the man who saved her family, the protector who fought for her children. Gratitude would take root, gratitude would grow, and eventually, he believed, it would bloom into something more. She would look at him again with the warmth she once had, and this time, she would never leave. In his own mind, the plan was flawless, a perfect marriage of revenge and desire, of personal vendetta and emotional manipulation. He would destroy Curtis's world while reclaiming Willow for himself, emerging not as a villain but as a savior in her eyes. Yet in his arrogance, Drew was blind to the truth that could bring it all crashing down. For Stella was not the naive, soft-hearted figure he imagined. Beneath her calm demeanor and grandmotherly warmth lay the instincts of a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating systems designed to break people. She had already begun to suspect Drew's intentions long before this day, and her suspicions had led her to dig deeper. Quietly, methodically, she had pieced together a puzzle that painted Drew not as a wronged man seeking justice, but as a manipulator and predator. The more she uncovered, the darker the picture became, until she found the most damning truth of all, Drew's role in manipulating Willow into aiding the kidnapping of Daisy. Stella's knowledge was not vague suspicion, it was concrete evidence, documents, recordings, timelines. She had secured it in multiple places, including one set held by a trusted friend outside the city, beyond Drew's reach. She moved carefully, never letting him see her hand, biding her time for the moment when exposing him would cause the maximum damage. And so, as Drew watched her from the shadows, convinced he was about to set his plan in motion, he was in fact stepping closer to the edge of his own undoing. Every move he plotted against Stella only served to tighten the noose she had been quietly weaving around him. The moment would come, she would make sure of it, when he realized too late that the hunter had become the hunted, and that the woman he thought to destroy was the one who would bring his empire crashing to the ground. What Drew could not begin to fathom was that Stella had been reading him for months, long before he ever considered her a target. Years of working in hospital corridors, navigating both bureaucratic red tape and the raw human suffering that seeped through its cracks, had honed in her a kind of second sight for people like him. She recognized the way charm could be weaponized, how a seemingly harmless smile could disguise a predatory mind, and she had long ago learned to distinguish between genuine goodwill and the calculated benevolence of someone who was only ever investing in others for future leverage. Drew's words, his controlled cadence, even the way he lingered near certain conversations without joining in, all of it had begun to ping against her instincts. The first spark of suspicion had been small, almost imperceptible. A name mentioned here, a look exchanged there, the faintest suggestion that Drew's concern for certain matters was too pointed, too specific to be casual. But it was the whispers about Daisy's disappearance that crystallized her unease into deliberate focus. Those whispers weren't the usual half-truths and gossip that swirled in the undercurrents of their community. They were sharp, oddly detailed in places and glaringly vague in others, like fragments of a story someone was trying to control. Stella knew enough to see the holes, and the more she examined them, the more they seemed deliberately cut. So she began to pull at the threads, not yanking, but gently, so as not to alert whoever was holding the other end. She spoke to people on the periphery of the incident, those who might not realize the significance of what they'd seen or heard. She revisited security logs, not as an investigator but as a concerned hospital worker curious about procedural gaps. She asked questions whose answers she already suspected, just to hear how the responses were framed. And each step drew her closer to a central figure whose shadow loomed over every lead, Drew. What she pieced together was worse than she had anticipated. This wasn't a man who had stumbled into wrongdoing. This was a man who had designed a scheme from the ground up. Willow had been his primary lever, her emotional vulnerabilities mapped and manipulated until she could be maneuvered into acting against her own moral compass. He had planted ideas in her mind with the precision of a surgeon, always making it seem as though she was making her own decisions while guiding her toward the one outcome he wanted, Daisy in his orbit, not as a victim he cared for but as a living tether to bind Willow to him for as long as he chose. The elegance of his cruelty was what chilled her most. It wasn't violent in the obvious sense, and that made it harder to prove, harder, that is, until Stella began finding the evidence. At first, it was circumstantial, a few dates that matched too neatly, movements that aligned with key developments in Daisy's disappearance. Then came the harder proof, documents that hinted at payments moved through intermediaries, travel records that contradicted public accounts, and, eventually, the most damning discovery of all, audio recordings. In those recordings, Drew's voice was crisp and calm, the voice of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was speaking to another party, an intermediary whose involvement could no longer be written off as peripheral. They discussed timelines, contingencies, and the exact psychological pressure points to apply to Willow to ensure her cooperation. There was no ambiguity. The intent was clear: Daisy's abduction was not an accident, not a reaction to unforeseen circumstances, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver. Stella understood instantly that a man like this couldn't simply be confronted. If she came at him directly, he would twist it, turn her into the aggressor, and use his connections to paint himself as the victim. No, she would need to dismantle him slowly, methodically, until the web he had spun collapsed in on him. And that meant time. She created redundancies for the evidence, treating it as though it were the most delicate patient file she had ever safeguarded. One complete set was hidden in her home, another in a secure storage unit under a name that couldn't be traced back to her, and the most vital set was entrusted to a friend outside the city, someone with no ties to Curtis, Portia, or anyone else who could be leveraged by Drew. That friend's instructions were simple: if anything happened to Stella, if she missed a scheduled check-in, the package would be delivered to both the authorities and the press. All the while, Stella maintained her public role to perfection. At community functions, she offered Drew the same polite greetings she extended to everyone else. At charity events, she spoke warmly to him when others were within earshot, crafting an image of cordiality that would make her eventual revelations even more devastating. If he thought she was oblivious, so much the better. It meant his guard would stay down. Every interaction was a reconnaissance mission, every passing smile a chance to note his mood, his tells, the way his eyes tightened when certain subjects arose. She built a mental catalog of these moments, tiny cracks in his composure that would one day help her deliver the final blow. What Drew didn't know was that Stella was already playing her own game of entrapment. She began subtly influencing the situations around him, creating opportunities for him to overreach, to leave traces of his schemes in places he believed were safe. She encouraged conversations that would tempt him to reveal his grievances against Curtis's family more openly, all the while knowing she had the means to document every word. And with each step, she tightened the invisible loop around him. To Drew, she was still the genial, unthreatening older woman in Curtis's circle. Easy to underestimate, easy to dismiss. But in reality, she was the architect of his undoing, patient enough to wait for the moment when pulling a single thread would cause his entire carefully constructed life to collapse in public view. And when that moment came, it would not be a quiet reckoning. It would be catastrophic, the kind of fall from grace no amount of power or money could reverse, because the truth Stella held was not just enough to ruin him, it was enough to erase him. Drew moved with the kind of assured precision that only comes from believing you have already won. The image of Stella and Portia's embrace had not left his mind, it had etched itself there, searing into his thoughts like a personal insult. He saw not warmth or compassion in that moment, but unity, a unity he could not break with whispers alone. To him, it was the perfect signal to escalate, to bring down the kind of blow that would send shockwaves through the Ashford family and destabilize them from the inside out. He stepped away from the crowd and into the shade of a quiet corner, pulling his phone from his pocket. The movement was fluid, habitual. This was not the act of a man hesitating or second-guessing himself. He scrolled to the encrypted numbers he kept reserved for his deepest connections. The ones who operated without questions, the ones who owed him debts they couldn't repay with money alone. When the line clicked, his voice was low, calm, but threaded with a steel that left no room for interpretation. He gave names, dates, and just enough context to make the request seem urgent yet routine: reopen and expand the investigation into the old insurance irregularities tied to Stella. In his mind, the results were already scripted. Stella's pristine image as a compassionate, rule-abiding advocate would crumble. The whispers of impropriety would grow into accusations, and accusations would grow into headlines. Her name would be dragged across the media, stripped of the quiet dignity she had worn like a badge for decades. Portia, blindsided, would have no choice but to retreat into defensive maneuvers, her attention consumed with protecting Stella from the fallout. And Curtis. Curtis would bear the humiliation like a millstone around his neck, unable to protect those closest to him from the destruction Drew had engineered. It was a masterstroke, Drew believed. A strike that would fracture them emotionally and publicly, forcing them into a reactive posture while he positioned himself to dictate the next moves. More than that, it would open the door to his true objective, cornering Portia. Once she was desperate enough, once the air around her was thick with scandal, she would be far easier to pressure into doing the unthinkable, altering Michael's medical records, planting the fabricated proof of addiction that would strip him of custody rights. It was not merely revenge, it was a calculated step toward regaining control of Willow through the children she loved. But Drew's confidence, so deeply rooted in his belief that he was the smartest man in the room, blinded him to the reality that every single step he was taking had been anticipated. Stella had known for weeks, months even, that the insurance issue would be his chosen weapon. She had deliberately left it vulnerable, like bait in a trap, knowing that his arrogance would not allow him to pass it by. She had prepared for this exact moment with the patience of a chess master, allowing him to reach for the piece she had already rigged to bring down his entire position. She wanted him to commit fully. She wanted him to leave his fingerprints on every stage of the attack, from the phone calls to his financial contacts to the subtle instructions that would leave a trail even he couldn't erase. Each move he made was being documented, quietly and thoroughly, by allies he didn't even know Stella had. These weren't people in her immediate circle, Drew would have spotted them if they were. They were quiet operators in places he would never think to look, people she had cultivated trust with over years, each of them with their own reasons for wanting to see him fall. Her plan wasn't simply to stop him, it was to make sure that when he fell, there would be no way back. She would allow the insurance investigation to proceed far enough for him to believe he had trapped her, to believe he was forcing her into a corner. And then, when the moment was perfect, she would turn the tables. The evidence she had collected, the recordings of Drew's voice detailing the manipulation of Willow, the financial trail that pointed to payments made during Daisy's abduction, the witness statements from those who had unknowingly seen pieces of the crime, would all be released in one coordinated strike. It would start with a leak. Not to law enforcement first, but to the media. A carefully timed, well-sourced exposé that laid out Drew's pattern of manipulation and abuse of power, drawing clear lines between his actions against Stella and the far darker crimes he had committed. The moment the story broke, it would be impossible for him to frame it as a baseless smear. The documents, recordings, and testimonies would be verifiable, damning, and already in the hands of journalists too determined, and too wary of Drew's influence, to be silenced. By the time the legal system moved in, the court of public opinion would already have delivered its verdict. His political career would not merely be damaged, it would be obliterated. The donors and allies who had propped him up would vanish overnight, unwilling to risk their own reputations by standing near his collapsing empire. The people he had once used as pawns, those he had manipulated into silence, would come forward, emboldened by the fact that he was no longer untouchable. They would testify, not just to his crimes but to the years of intimidation, coercion, and quiet destruction he had left in his wake. And Drew, the man who had once moved through every room as though it were his by right, would find himself cornered in a very different way. No longer the architect of the game, he would be the hunted animal in it, every path of escape blocked, every potential ally turned into an accuser. The strategies he had relied on for so long, fear, pressure, and the exploitation of weakness, would collapse under the weight of the truth Stella had set free. When it was over, there would be no rebuilding. No comeback. His name would be synonymous with deceit and ruin, not power and influence. And at the center of it all, standing with the quiet dignity he had tried so hard to destroy, would be Stella. The woman he had once dismissed as a soft target would be revealed as the one who had orchestrated his destruction from the very beginning, her patience and foresight guiding every step until the final blow landed. She wouldn't just win. She would make sure the world knew exactly how she had done it. And Drew, stripped of his illusions, would be left to realize that the trap he had thought he was setting for her had, all along, been set for him. In the end, the reckoning came not with a sudden crash, but with the slow, deliberate inevitability of a storm that had been gathering far beyond the horizon. Drew, still basking in the illusion of control, was midway through his private celebration, convinced his assault on Stella was tightening into a perfect chokehold. He had spent the morning exchanging quiet messages with his financial contacts, confident that the insurance investigation was moving exactly as he intended.